What is going on YouTube? This is Acid Root. So I'm going to review the sixth album by Papa Roach. Basically, this album is called Metamorphosis, and it came out in the spring of 2009. Now, I had reviewed a number of Papa Roach albums between like 2015 and 2016. Reviewed plenty of them, like the Paramore Sessions, Love, Hate, Tragedy, Getting Away with Murder, Infest, some of those type ones. Even their 2012 album, but I didn't get to this one. I finally wanted to get to this one just to see what it's about. Particularly, the reason why I didn't was just because it was a drastic change from like the early Papa Roach that I remember, like the more new metal stuff and alternative metal stuff. There's really not any alternative metal on here. It's a completely different kind of pitch. When they talk about metamorphosizing, that is the truth, is because you get a little bit of glam metal in here, but mostly like more hard rock kind of boilers. Is something that's fit for like a pub or like a good bar, someplace like that, where you'd hear more kind of vintage, like motorcycle club type tunes as far as that kind of goes. Just interested in that kind of affability because I feel like Jacoby Shaddix feels more of like a vintage kind of rock star ripped out of like 1986 or something like that. But I look after it, I do feel like I'm someone that didn't have a problem with Papa Roach from like the early 2000s. So this was kind of a differential change that maybe wasn't necessary, but I guess it can kind of be refreshing in a sense, just so they didn't get painted into a corner of having like a typical style. Because maybe there's certain, like, I feel like their two highest charting albums were basically like Infest and then Getting Away with Murder, which both had some hit singles on each of them. Like, of course, there's like the song Last Resort off of Infest, and then there's a couple hit singles off of Getting Away with Murder. But then this album actually had a #1 hit rock single on this album, which was basically the third single or the second single, Lifeline. But I don't recall hearing that song on the radio that much, but I do have to say that this is a decent album. But I do feel like Infest and Getting Away with Murder and Love, Hate, Tragedy are just more affable. Those are just more vintage. I kind of miss the alternative metal and new metal kind of Papa Roach. I mean, it's cool that they try some new things, but I'm used to like that typical Papa Roach. So that just kind of happens to be a thing. But I look after it like there is enough on here to warrant. It's not like they completely belly flop when it comes to some of these singles that they tried. Like, I definitely like Hollywood Horror, and I do like most of the singles on here. I would have to say, in some fashion, at least to a certain degree, I do like them, but they're just different. So if you really are expecting, if you come to this Papa Roach album second after listening to something like Infest or one of their early 2000s kind of new metal alternative projects, is just not going to be the same feeling. So that's just kind of the concept. This really is like a breath of fresh air in a lot of ways. So I just would have to say, to kind of talk about that, there were 4 singles on this album, and the first single is Hollywood Horror. Like, Hollywood Horror is kind of like the closest thing to vintage Papa Roach a little bit. It's still kind of hard rock tinge, but this is still pretty hard rock tinge, but this is basically like a late evening bop for outdoor sessions. I would definitely say it's a vanilla rock bruiser, and it's just very hazed. I would feel like this is just kind of one that's like I was saying, the closest thing to like old school kind of Papa Roach. I mean, the hard rock theme about it kind of suits them somewhat, but it just kind of feels like out of character for them, just because they just were more typical kind of punk rockish, and they kind of have ditched some of the punk type feeling of that particular old style that they had for just more of like a more vintage kind of like Motley Crue or like folks like that, like uh Guns N' Roses, Motley Crue, just those type vibes as far as that kind of goes. I mean, I feel like it's a particular style that's okay, but I do like this song. This is probably my favorite of the singles on here. I feel like Hollywood Horror and then I Almost Told You That I Loved You are the two best ones in terms of the single format. This is definitely one, but the thing about Hollywood Horror is it just didn't get a lot of airplay. Like, Wikipedia had said that it just didn't get a ton of airplay. So the concept about it, this is not one that you're going to commonly hear on the radio as far as that kind of goes, but it's just an overall solid one. It has a pretty hazy kind of late evening kind of malaise about it as far as that kind of concept is. Good for like a outdoor kind of smoke session, some of those type feelings as far as that kind of goes. Just vintage. Like, if you do have like a playlist of some Papa Roach from like the early 2000s, this would probably still fit in decently well, or solidly enough well, with some of the stuff of like vintage Papa Roach. It's a good one. Lifeline is the second single, and this is an almost song. This is one that I was talking about that hit #1 on the mainstream rock charts in the United States. So this is like a stock blue collar single. I would feel like it's basic, makeshift, and marketable single from Papa Roach. So this is just kind of one where you think of like some of those kind of cranked out ones that you hear there was like a single that came out by Green Day around this time. It's like 21 Guns or something like that. I don't remember what that one's called, but something from like Papa Roach's 21st Century Breakdown, one of those singles, the more kind of like power ballad makeshift kind of single that was just made for blue collar, where they do have like those club singles, but then they go to like a makeshift kind of one. That's kind of what this song is. It's just the radio ready one. This is the one that probably sold the units off the album. This is just the radio ready. It's an almost song for me. It's because I like some of the kind of peppy. I do like the kind of more slacking and just kind of edgier, just kind of more recreational Papa Roach, which is just not on here overabundantly enough. This one's a little bit more straightforward and has a lot more messaging about it. This one just has a lot more kind of broadcast to say, but this is just one. This one's not quite as like healthy as much, but it is just like the factory radio ready one that you probably heard throughout 2009 and the early 2010s and such. This is just kind of the unit seller and the one that was like the most blue collar and the award winning one that just had like, if you were talking about Papa Roach in the late 2000s, this is probably a good song that you heard. Is this, I mean, this one's kind of, this one's just like standard rock. This is just makeshift rock here, like the sort of stuff that you'd get cranked out of like Foo Fighters or like Creed or someone like that. It's not quite alternative metal, but it might be like alternative rock, just kind of hard rock, just with like a mild kind of sense of punk attached to it. Just not very much, but it's vanilla rock basically, I would say. It's kind of happens to be a thing, but the third single is I Almost Told You That I Loved You, and this is another hard rock nightclub gem, I would say. It's a good night venue jingle, and it's very affable. I Almost Told You That I Loved You has like really pounding riffs on here. This one just really feels like a bar song and kind of like that karaoke kind of energy of just like a riveting kind of drinks up kind of time for the weekend, something like that. I mean, it's a good, lively kind of single, definitely some nightclub kind of energy and weekend kind of energy, but it's just different from typical Papa Roach. Like the party singles on this album are just different compared to some of the ones that were on like Papa Roach's earlier albums like Infest, Love, Hate, Tragedy, and Getting Away with Murder. And I kind of feel like this is kind of like the oddball album when it comes to like nightlife and such, where I do feel like some of this hard rock kind of numbers and thumpers for outgoingness kind of work in some stretch. I kind of feel like Papa Roach's strengths at alternative rock and alternative metal are just stronger in like the vintage Papa Roach. It's interesting that they tried some new stuff, but I still feel like Infest and some of the early ones are just superior when it comes to like that nightlife kind of fare. But these are decent ones. These are definitely like motorcycle club and nightclub hard rock kind of bar, hard rock cafe type places as far as that kind of goes with that sort of concepts. It's interesting. They kind of leveled up, but I still feel like their earlier stuff, but you get the concept. So talk about the fourth single, Had Enough. Had Enough is kind of like a peppy, healthy blue collar malaise. It's just about positive change and that type of stuff. And it's got a pretty good kind of malaise kind of beat on here, but it's just kind of one with a little bit more social commentary, the same sort of stuff that Green Day was doing in 2009, that sort of more food for thought kind of pitch. It's interesting enough, but this one's not quite as recreational. This is just kind of like the more malaise and kind of sunsetting kind of sequel to like Lifeline. I'd say both Lifeline and Had Enough are both the kind of more blue collar ones just for makeshift and that sort of concept, but this one's just a little bit more malaise about it. This kind of feels a little bit more dreary, but I do like the concept. It's an almost song for me if I haven't mentioned that. Had Enough is kind of an almost song because I do like it somewhat, but it just is a little bit more kind of unctuous than maybe wholesomely what I would have wanted. I feel like some of these songs on here just have a lot more food for thought, and I really feel like, considering how crazed that Papa Roach and Jacoby Shaddix were in the early 2000s, I was kind of looking for at least something. Like, I know some folks will say, like, there are some folks that feel like Papa Roach's best song is probably Last Resort, and I don't feel that way, but I kind of look after it that I do think that the craziness of that song is very affable. I do think that the overall kind of malaise, angsty kind of energy, bloodletting kind of energy of that song needs to be replicated more. They just should have songs like that often, where I feel like the maturity that they kind of showcased on this album has some of that, but I look after it. I don't know. It's just you'll see as we talk about the rest of this album that it just kind of has a lot more healthiness towards it. You'll see as we talk about the rest of this album that this album has a lot more healthiness towards it. That's just more upbeat than typical Papa Roach. This is just kind of like a new fashion about them that doesn't quite suit them as well. I kind of miss some of the old alternative metal them, a little bit more angsty. But yeah, so to kind of talk about, there's 11 songs on here. And out of those 11 songs, I recommend 5 plus 2 almost songs. So to talk about those songs I recommend, the 5 songs I recommend would be Hollywood Whore, I Almost Told You That I Loved You, Change or Die, Nights of Love, and Live This Down. And the 2 almost songs are Had Enough and Lifeline. So to talk about some more of these, like Change or Die is another one that's very similar to like I Almost Told You That I Loved You. That's another good one. It has some pounding riffs on here. It's just a beefy kind of nightclub craze, I would say, and it has riveting feels of a time This is definitely one of the more crazed ones on here, but once again, it's kind of more in like the hard rock kind of setting. Change or Die just kind of has like, this is another one that's pretty crazed, just like I Almost Told You That I Loved You. That's the same kind of concept. It's definitely more of like a hard rock cafe and hard rock bar kind of one as far as that kind of goes, but it's a little bit, I mean, this one has like the riveting, the energy is probably the most turned up. This is probably one of the most riveting songs on the project, but it still is different Papa Roach. So this is not like their typical alternative metal wails, and this is not their typical kind of alternative metal craziness and just like bloodletting that they do in the past. So this is one that's just more hard rock, kind of litty, kind of leather jacket type fare as far as that kind of goes in that sort of concept. But it is a crazed one. I feel like Hollywood Horror, I Almost Told You That I Loved You, and Change or Die all kind of have like a more bar and kind of pub type atmosphere for just some riveting kind of energy, but it works. Live This Down is kind of a dispute song. By that I kind of mean like bickering relationship type fare. This is a dispute song that kind of feels like house party beef, I would say, and it's just a good social jam. This is kind of one that's unlike Papa Roach's most. This is kind of one that's most unlike Papa Roach's pitch for this particular album. It's a good one to kind of have because this gives me vibes of like vintage Papa Roach and such, where they just were more angsty in some of that kind of context. So this is kind of one that just kind of feels a lot more residential and local kind of affairs as far as that kind of goes. Definitely like this one, like the riveting energy and riffs on the song as far as that kind of goes. It's a nice lively one for outdoor sessions. And then Nights of Love is kind of like a glam rock song. This is definitely one that feels like malaise, kind of dusky haze, I would say. It's definitely some mellow glam rock sleaze, I would say. And this is a song for quick and fast life, but it's a thoughtful song. So this is kind of one where if you're just kind of living fast, living quick, that sort of stuff, but you're just kind of in the mood for some introspection and that sort of malaise about it, it's a good one for that. It's just kind of like, and it's just kind of a good one for in between that sort of fashion as far as that kind of goes. It's just a good highlight. And yeah, I mean, for the most part, I don't really sense like the glam rock and glam metal on here. I kind of feel like some of this is like 1985, 1987 hard rock that's similar to like Guns N' Roses and Motley Crue and like some of those type ones, other 80s kind of bands as far as that kind of goes. But I don't really sense like that glam as much. I kind of, maybe it's, yeah, I just don't really see it as much. I definitely see the hard rock tinges. I definitely see like the motorcycle bars and hard rock cafe type places as far as that kind of goes, but I don't see as much of like the kind of glam metal. But to talk about some of this album, there's just a bunch of tracks on here. Talk about the rest of the songs I didn't enjoy, like to talk about some of the songs I didn't enjoy on here. Like I feel like songs like March Out of the Darkness, Into the Light, and Carry Me all kind of had like a more upbeat and kind of more food for thought kind of atmosphere that just didn't suit Papa Roach that well. And I know that they did have some of those songs like that on their earlier albums, but the pitch behind it, just with this newfangled style on top of like some of these kind of mood switches, which is just different from their angsty kind of vibes of their earlier years, just kind of made it like a complete like 180 in terms of the format that you're just used to. So it's really like something that you have to kind of be roll with the punches and kind of vibe just with whatever things that they throw at you, as opposed to kind of having some familiarity. So it's just kind of, I feel like that kind of makes this album kind of patchy. And State of Emergency was just kind of like a malaised one that was similar to Nights of Love, but just a worse version of that. So there's just kind of some ones on here that kind of felt like the new shifts, just all the newness factor. I think it's just maybe more culture shock than what was probably necessary. I feel like this is maybe too much of a new album, where there are some moments on here like Live This Down, Hollywood Horror, that kind of have vintage Papa Roach, but it's just very minimal. It's just kept to a minimum as far as like the stuff that they were doing. I kind of feel like the concept that, you know, when you get new things from artists as far as that kind of goes, if it just is completely different, it just doesn't feel like Papa Roach. And I think that concept that there needed to be some reminder that, hey, this is Jacoby Shaddix. This is the same guy that gave you Last Resort and Between Angels and Insects and some of that type of stuff, but it just didn't have that same context as far as trying to get those strengths. I just feel like this is a lot patchier an album compared to some of the stuff. Now it's good. I mean, I do feel like hard rock is decent. It's a decent suit for them in terms of some of the things that is seen, but alternative metal is just sheerly better. Now, this is kind of the concept about it. And it's the same thing with the singles, where I feel like the singles are affable, but compared to some of the ones that I would listen to, it just is kind of more offhanded to the sheer degree as to how much I'd listen to these compared to some of Papa Roach's more familiar kind of hits. But it's new. I mean, if you're looking for something different, if you do want something out of the ordinary, it's there. So me liking basically 5 songs out of 12 plus 2 almost songs. That'd be basically about 7 songs out of 11 on here, despite the fact that 2 of them are almost songs. I'm going to go ahead and give this album like a 6 out of 10. I feel like that's about as high as I can really go with it. I mean, it's middle of the road. It's a little bit better than average. If I just kind of look after it, it's still, I mean, Papa Roach has gotten higher scores from me, and I've liked a lot of their albums a lot more than that. I feel like some of their early stuff really kind of rang true for me in terms of that concept, but I just was kind of somewhat disappointed just in the fact that it just these new styles were not quite as sheerly catchy. I mean, the energy is definitely there. There are some hard rock bar kind of atmospheres about some of these concepts, but I didn't like the concept that there just was nothing from like hardly nothing from like their old days, just as like a sense of familiarity. So that's just kind of the concept. But I mean, it is new, so it's just something to kind of have. But it gets a 6 out of 10. The social score I'll go ahead and give a 7.5 out of 10 because there's a number of songs on here that do have that affability. Is really like this album is really just like some glam rock, hard rock kind of sleaze. So it has a decent approach to nightlife, but it's just kind of in a different pitch. And there is like some peppiness and healthiness to this album. Like I was saying before, it does kind of have some songs like Had Enough is like that. Into the Light, March Out of the Darkness, Carry Me, State of Emergency. There's just a good chunk of songs on this album that do kind of have food for thought and more message and just like a healthier sense as far as like they're not just stoners who are just, going out and getting drunk all night and that type of stuff as far as that kind of goes and just having riveting kind of after hours parties as far as that kind of goes. But the concept about it's not like there's a problem with that. I do think that they should have cut loose a little bit more, something in that context. But that's just kind of the thing. But in terms of the future, like Papa Roach has had a steady string of albums, so there is more to some of these that I need to review. I'm definitely going to review like their 2017 album and their 2015 album. I need to get to some more of those, but that's just kind of the concept. They do have a good assortment of more albums to get reviewed. So yeah. But this is like, a little bit above average stuff here.